The Jetsons epitomizes the fantasy of white flight in space seen in the show's 1962 pilot episode. The final sequence of the episode, in which the family rolls off to bed, captures the troubling nature of the portrayals of women, both housewives and women of color, in sitcoms of this era, while also hinting at the dangers it predicts as technology advances. The show hinges on archetypal characters, one of which is the nagging housewife Jane Jetson. As Mary Beth Harlovic writes, sitcoms of the era established the suburban fantasy in part through implementing gender-specific functional spaces, the family space of the kitchen for women. Jane is shown only in the common space of the house. Despite the fact that women's work was at the base of society at the time, domestic labor was still seen as lesser than men's labor. This attitude is changing somewhat. As Alice Leppert says, the Kardashians have profited from being shrewd businesswomen who love to clean house. Although this is not necessarily shown to be a bad thing, it does continue the stereotype of women in the home, which Jane is. The Jetsons pilot episode frames Jane as the epitome of a white housewife. Rosie the Robot is an example of the 1960s desperation to maintain the sanctity of whitewashed suburbia. Rosie is coded in this episode as a black woman, similar to Beulah, fitting the stereotype of a mammy character. She is independent and sassy, traits which are out of place on a robot, and she is physically larger than any of the other characters, able to carry George Jetson. It is clear in the context of the racial tension of this era that Rosie is meant to be a black maid, but this episode denies black women even this paltry representation. This was not uncommon, as stations excluded people of color for fear of backlash against broadcast miscegenation or the mixing of races on television shows. Through this coding of Rosie as a mammy, the show is able to perpetuate stereotypes about black women and maids while still appeasing the potentially racist viewer base. This episode is a fearful response to many new home appliances of the 1960s, which were designed to ease a housewife's workload. This concept is amplified in the Jetsons as Rosie is able to take over nearly all of Jane's motherly and housewifely duties. Jane is obsolete, outdone by technology, and unbothered by the change. Rosie, as a robot with only a desire to care for the family, now sets an unrealistic expectation for black maids. What we see in the Keeping Up with the Kardashians episode, Managing Mom, is that technology, specifically telephones and voicemail, both facilitates and complicates their daily lives. Perhaps the Jetsons was prescient in predicting complications of technology in the future, but their pilot episode's intersection of technology and stereotype only reaffirms the sexism and the racism of the era. The pilot episode of the Jetsons, Rosie the Robot, closes with a sequence that paints Jane as a useless housewife, black women as maids lacking free will, and technology as something that will ruin women as a productive force. The Kardashians contradict this assertion as high-powered businesswomen, although they may struggle still with balancing personal and professional lives. And despite its innocent appearance and likely intentions, the first episode of The Jetsons manages to be extremely harmful and stereotypical.